to my everyone, and welcome to this third Tuesday in the month of June. Wow, just like that. It is Tuesday, June 17, 2025. How have you been? What a joy, what a delight, what a pleasure, what a privilege to welcome you warmly to Amaget Radio Communications, to my program, Driving Economic Growth with Innovation. This is Amaget Radio Communications once again, and my name is Tolu Omodara. How have you been? What a joy, what a privilege, what a delight. And I say what a privilege because of course, you probably know that a lot has happened in the last 1 week. There has been a very fatal air crash in India that has claimed over 240 lives. Of course, there was one sole survivor, a miracle survivor. There have been clashes in the Middle East. For those who live in Nigeria, there has been spate of killings, apparently a renewed spate of killings in Benue. For those who live in Iran, there have been all kinds of things that I can go on and on. There have been more of drone attacks from Russia on Ukraine, even in the last 24 hours or thereabouts in Minnesota. There has been an unusual politically motivated assassination. So when I say it's a privilege to welcome you warmly, I mean it's a privilege. Life is a privilege, right? I want us to start on that note today. Thank you for being here. We are grateful for the privilege of life. We are grateful for the reminder that we are supposed to use every moment impactfully as possible, because life is a gift, right? And so we are grateful for the privilege of doing this. We are grateful for the privilege of life. We are grateful for the privilege of the opportunity to keep impacting our space here in Amaget at Amaget Radio Communications. We're also grateful for the privilege of your life, right? For the privilege for you to be here. It's a privilege for you as well to be alive. And as you listen to us, we hope that you will take full advantage of the privilege of life to give back and to continue to act on these things we discuss, especially if you happen to be a policymaker or a policy influencer or even a policy demander that has, the opportunity and the privilege to make change. Well, it's on this note that I welcome you to the next edition of Driving Economic Growth with Innovation. This happens to be the 9th edition for the quarter. Wow, we'll soon be wrapping up this program for the quarter, right? Last week, we spoke about leadership, right? The role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic goals. I repeat, last week our focus was on the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic goals. And last week we had said that we were not likely to finish it, and we're going to continue and wrap it up this week. Before we do, again, let me emphasize that this program, the theme of it is driving economic growth with innovation. And like we said last week, there are two parts of that equation. The first part is innovation, and the second part is economic growth. I repeat, there are two parts to that equation. The first part is innovation, and of course, the second part is economic growth, right? Like we've been emphasizing from the very beginning of this quarter, yes, there has to be innovation, but it's not innovation for the sake of innovation. It's innovation for the sake of economic growth, right? And these are some of the things we emphasized last week, and we're going to do a quick recap of some of the main highlights of last week as we go into part 2 of the topic, the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth. I repeat, the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth, right? So we're looking at part 2, but just before we do, let's do a quick recap of some of the highlights from the first part. Now, the main thing we started with last week is that word I just mentioned now, equation. We're introducing another phrase, a common phrase if you grew up where I grew up, if you went through your mathematics class, especially at the high school level or the secondary school level, depending on how you call it, right? It is a simultaneous equation. Driving economic growth with innovation is a simultaneous equation, right? A simultaneous equation usually has two parts, but there is often an equalizer, so to say, the equal to sign. Now, equal to sign, and that is the critical factor, the leadership factor, right? So driving economic growth with innovation is like solving a simultaneous equation. innovation being one part of the equation and economic growth being the other part of the equation, and leadership is the critical equalizer. The critical connection between innovation and economic growth, like we said last week, is not going to happen by itself. Very, very important. It is so critical that we need to speak more directly to it. We implied it. We've implied it from the beginning of the quarter. We also spoke to it in the first quarter where we discussed the theme. Developing national innovation systems for absorptive capacity. The national innovation systems, of course, being the ability to, to create, to invent, and so on and so forth. But the absorptive capacity there being the purpose for which we are creating and inventing, right? The purpose for which we are developing our national innovation systems is for economic growth. Last quarter, we talked about the absorptive capacity, which helps to translate creativity and knowledge into economic and social development. Now, that translator is leadership, right? Without effective leadership, like we said last week, you might have all the innovative systems in the world, and I hope we can really call them innovative systems if they cannot lead to commercialization. But let's just imagine that you have all the innovative systems, all the systems capable of translating into full-scale commercialized innovation, but without effective leadership, the commercializability may not become a reality. I repeat, without effective leadership, the commercializability of your inventive activities will not become a reality. And that was the point we started with last week. That the critical connector between innovation and economic growth is not going to happen by itself. It's very critical. We do not, we do not create for the sake of creating at a national level. We do not create for the sake of creating, even at an institutional level, right? Especially when you're talking about private sector organizations, right? Even public sector institutions should still be directing their inventive activities and stimulating private sector growth. That is if there is effective coordination. And that's the big if. That's the big equalizer, right? If innovation is not going to be merely for the sake of innovation, then leadership must take overall responsibility for synchronizing it with economic growth. I repeat, if innovation is not going to be merely for the sake of innovation, then leadership must take overall accountability for synchronizing it with economic growth. These are still the highlights from last week, critical highlights from last week. If we are going to have national innovation systems that support deliberate targeted economic growth, then leadership must not only have the oversight function, but leadership must play the oversight role as effectively as possible. Very, very important. If we're not going to have national innovation systems that support, take note of the words, deliberate, targeted economic growth, then leadership must not only have the oversight function, but leadership must play the oversight role as effectively as possible. Now, what does it mean for leadership to play this oversight role as effectively as possible? Because you may have a function in name, right? The leadership may have a function in title, but is leadership discharging the role as effectively as possible? Now, how do we know? What does it require? We also broke that down. We said there must be a visionary leadership ensuring that the creativity and invention that is being carried out, and the output from these creative and inventive activities does not end there. The outputs do not end there, but the output actually leads to an outcome, ultimately translating into economic growth for nations. I think I need to say that again. There must be, we are defining the effective leadership that would ensure that national innovation systems support deliberate targeted economic growth. We said there must be a visionary leadership. It begins with a vision, a visionary leadership that ensures that creativity and inventiveness will not just be outputs that end there, but that they actually lead to an outcome and ultimately translate into economic growth for nations. Very, very important. But it begins with a vision. I'm not going to go into the depth of that. Like we always encourage you to please subscribe to our Amogate Radio Communications YouTube page. Go back to this episodes, to this broadcast, because even for us, we continue to do these things because we are passionate about supporting national growth, supporting institutional development, supporting organizational profitability, and we know the wealth of knowledge that we are depositing into these resources for you, right? This is coming from about 17 years of supporting nations, public sector institutions, private sector organizations. We know what we do, and we do what we know by the grace of God. It is very important. So I'm not going to, uh, repeat the things that were said last week in detail. I'm just drawing some highlights that are critical, and we'll build on that as we continue in this week by the grace of God. So, when you have this visionary leadership that ensures that creativity and inventiveness will not just be outputs that end there, but lead to outcomes that ultimately translate into economic growth, right? When we have that, that visionary lead will, ensure that there's an effective synchronization between economic growth and innovation systems and activities. That's the first thing. The visionary lead will begin to think about, how do we take note of the word I use. We begin to think about how do we synchronize these innovative activities and economic goals. And that's why we also said cognitive leadership is crucial, because it is when you think that you begin to see. And I said I wasn't going to go into the depth of that last week for the sake of time, but just take note of the fact that visionary leadership is about seeing. And we said, you see, even the vision, what you see first begins with when you think. Leadership has the responsibility for cognitive direction. That leader has the responsibility to look at data, very, very important. Look at the trends, the data in your region, the data in your nation, the data with your peer nations, the data with, the nations you're trying to be like, you're aspiring towards. The cognitive leadership has a responsibility for cognitive direction, and that leadership will look at data, will, look at trends, do some benchmarking, peer analysis, take longitudinal studies over a given period, identify patterns. Now, all that thinking, we said last week, should eventually produce a vision, right? Should eventually lead to a certain scene. From that thinking, from that cognitive leadership, right, would come a vision, a clear vision of how leadership wants to synchronize national innovation and economic growth. Very, very important. The cognitive leadership would lead to the vision setting, right? You have to do some thinking before you can be seen. And this was all the things we said last week, like I said. From the thinking, reflection, analysis, from all of that should flow a certain vision that aims to drive a greater correlation between national innovation activities and economic growth, as well as goals. Very, very, very important. I'll share just one or two more things from last week, and then we plunge into the deep for this week. So we said that there's a nation called Indonesia in the continent of Asia that came up with a long-term national development plan with 8 clearly stated development missions. Very important, 8. This was a 20-year plan, and we gave this example just to buttress the point that it takes leadership to set direction for the synchronization of innovative activities with economic growth, right? So they had a 20-year plan from 2005 to 2025, and they broke this 20-year plan into 4 medium-term plans of 5 years each. Now, the first one was generally introductory, which is understandable for planning, but the second medium-term plan began to look strongly at the need for increasing the quality of human resources, including the efforts to build capacity in science and technology in order to strengthen competitiveness. That was interesting for me. They were very specific that, look, we are strengthening we are building capacity in science and technology in order to strengthen our economic competitiveness. So they were very clear about making that connection between their innovative capacity and their economic competitiveness. So for them, it's not about developing science and technology capacity just for the sake of having some, scientific fun, but it's to strengthen economic competitiveness. So the overall leadership saw and facilitated the connecting point between human capacity development and science and technology for the sake of innovation. The leadership then also went further to ensure that they were connecting the Ministry of Labor with the Ministry of Science and Technology, and they went, even further to guarantee that at least there was an attempt to translate this into Indonesia's economic competitiveness. That was in the second term medium development plan. Now, for their third medium-term development plan from 2015 to 2019, remember the first one was 2005 to 2010. The second one was from 20 I think from 2011 or thereabouts. Um, the first one was 2005 2009. The second one was 2010 to 2014. The third one was 2015 to 2019. So for this third medium-term development plan from 2015 to 2019, they then said Indonesia's economic competitiveness will rely not just on sustainable natural resources management and competent human resources, but also on improved science and technology capacity. In other words, what they started in the second phase in terms of science and technology capacity building was to be strengthened further in the third phase. And in this third phase, they said the role of science and technology has been recognized in a presidential decree. See the level of leadership involvement that we're advocating for at the level of the presidency, right? So in the third phase, they said the role of science and technology has been recognized in the presidential decree, I think it was presidential decree number 32, in what they called the master plan for enhancement of expansion, for enhancement and expansion, of Indonesia's economic development. Now, this is the presidency taking full responsibility of the role of science and technology in economic development and facilitating that synchronization between innovation and economic development, right? I think these are things to take critical note of from last week's episode. Like I said, please go back to the episode if you listened already. If you get to listen, go and listen. And then we were going to go from there into the second and the concluding part of the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic goals, right? So today we are looking at the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic goals, part 2, doing the target 3. I repeat. Today we are looking at the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic goals, part 2, doing the targeting. Last week we said when there is effective leadership, we would ask ourselves at the national level, what are we targeting our innovation activities at? Remember what we said about leadership beginning with vision, especially after the thinking. Then comes the vision, right? Then comes the vision setting. Then comes the goal setting. Now, part of that goal setting is to say, what are we targeting our innovation activities at? Let me give you an example. Sometimes you can say, a nation can say, we're going to target our innovation activities at developing soft power. Right? We want to develop diplomatic influence in other nations. We already have economic power, we have military power, but we don't have sufficient soft power influence, right? And so we begin to support, for instance, the growth of SMEs that are invested in technological development in other nations, in other regions, in other continents. And we're doing this very deliberately. We're investing for instance, in providing them with technological tools. We are also supporting them maybe with grants, with funds, and so on and so forth, right? So it's important to ask the question, what exactly are we targeting our innovative activities? Are we sharing our software know-how? Are we building further software know-how to strengthen our soft power, or maybe to develop our hard power? Right. I was referring to Ukraine-Russia war when we started. I don't know if you know about, I think about 10 days ago, I would say roughly 10 days ago, Ukraine targeted some drones at America. Sorry, beg your pardon. Ukraine targeted some drones at Russia, right? I'm still going to come to America. You see why America is coming into what I'm saying here. So Ukraine targeted some drones at at Russia, and the drones they targeted at Russia were of significantly less financial value. Take note, financial value than the infrastructure, the military infrastructure that the drones destroyed. However, the drones had a level of technological capabilities, and because of that level of technological capabilities, they caused a lot of damage in Russia. And when they caused a lot of damage, it was so much, the impact was so much that America had to ask for some kind of updating of their legislation as well as their technological capabilities to scan their airwaves, to scan their airspace, because yes, you can have all the military infrastructure in terms of, hard power, but technological know-how can be a very critical game changer in today's world. Of course, the world was expecting a reprisal, and today, unfortunately, the news is out that Russia has also targeted several drones. I think in that same space, Iran also hit Israel with drones, and Israel similarly retaliated. And a lot is going on. I'm saying the world, has changed, and what you're targeting your innovative activities as a nation, I must be honest with you, needs to be very strategically defined, right? You can be targeting it at gaining soft power, but you can also be targeting it at growing hard power. I remember during the last quarter when we were discussing developing national innovation systems of absorptive capacity, I remember saying that at a point during the Russia-Ukraine war, I think America was threatening not to provide military infrastructure for Ukraine at some point. And what was interesting was America was saying that, they had provided a lot of support for the war and they could define what happens with the war. And the reality was that Europe actually had provided more financially, but a lot of the technological support for the war was coming from America. In other words, you can have all the financial resources, right? But if you do not have in today's world, if you do not have sufficient innovative capacity, you still may not call the shot as far as your national defense is concerned. So it's a matter of so many criticalities, right? To be able to develop your economic power by ensuring you have targeted innovation. Now, as I was preparing for this episode, I smiled and said to myself, you may be wondering, what's the connection between your defense and your economy? A lot. A whole lot. The data is out there indicating that you need to have a strong and reliable defense before you can have sustainable economic progress. I repeat, the data is overwhelming, right, in the direction of the connection of the correlation between national defense and economic progress. So even to have that economic competitiveness for investors to bring their resources into your nation, to invest in businesses in your nation, in initiatives in your nation, even in new technologies in your nation, they need to have a level of assurance that you can protect your nation, that you have the defense of your nation. And sometimes it's not just about the money, it's also about you being in control of the technology for your own defense. That's how critical it is. So remember, when you talk about the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic goals part 2, right, we're looking at doing the targeting. And the first question you need to ask as a visionary leader is, what exactly are we targeting? Are we targeting soft power? That's an example. Are we targeting economic stability? That's another possibility. Are we targeting hard power? That's another one based on some of the examples I just gave. Very, very important. What are we targeting, right? And that's where the vision comes, especially from the thinking. And that's why I talked about the need to gather data. Where are we weak in? Where are we strong in? What are the areas of our competitive advantage? Where do we want to compete? Do we want to, for instance, become a monopoly as much as possible in some areas where we have comparative strength, or do we want to become one of the key players? I can go on and on. There are so many possibilities, but this is where the visionary leadership comes in. The visionary leadership, like we said last week, helps to ensure that you are competing as strategically as possible. And we attempted to define the concept of strategic targeting. That's where you can attain optimal gain, so to say, where you can get maximum results based on efficient use of resources. So you have to answer the question, what are we targeting? Ultimately, as far as leadership is concerned, the accountability for doing the targeting resides with the overall leadership. I gave the example of the presidential decree in Indonesia. In China, about, I think, almost 40 years ago, in 1978, we also gave the example of a formal recognition of the important role of science and technology in economic development. That was as far back as almost 50 years ago, beg your pardon, right? About 47 years ago, the premier, I think, identified and clearly stated, even giving this a tagline, saying that science and technology are the primary productive force for economic and social development. This was over 40 years ago, almost 50 years ago. So this is the level of leadership that we are calling for, right, on this program. The level of leadership we are advocating for, and we are insisting, if I may use that word, needs to get involved with the synchronization of national innovation systems and economic growth. Very, very important. The commander-in-chief role, depending on what you call it, some nations will call it commander-in-chief, some will call it president, some will call it prime minister, whatever. But at that level of overall leadership, that's what we believe, right? The accountability for doing this targeting resides with that of the overall leadership. Why? Because those who occupy that role will have the oversight. They will see the point of connectivity more easily because they have the helicopter vision, right? They oversee all the activities, and so they can target more strategically, right? And remember, the strategic leadership there also comes from thinking still, right? What are the areas of our most critical needs? What are the areas of our greatest leverage as a nation? Very important. The overall leadership is, accountable for guaranteeing that efficient synchronization between different touch points. Sometimes the touch points would be between education and innovation, for instance. Sometimes you will see a deliberate stimulation of interest in STEM. We spoke about that a lot last quarter, in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Sometimes you also see a review of curriculum. Sometimes you have to go back and look at the curriculum, not just the content, sometimes even the manner of delivery, right? How do we ensure that the manner of delivery is helping our innovators to begin to think more economically, right? When they are creating, they must be creating in a manner that is targeted as promptly as possible, as early as possible in the game towards economic development. And again, these are some of the things we said last quarter when we talked about the need to ensure that we are raising more multi-sectoral minded innovators, because sometimes you find that even from the stage of the curriculum, if you're not careful, we are raising science students to think only scientifically, and we are raising economic students to think only economically, when sometimes we actually have talent that are capable of operating effectively in both dimensions, in both economic and scientific dimensions, right? And just so you know, I'm already seeing programs that are more integrated. I'm already seeing nations coming up with curriculum for those who have the capability to explore those fields where they are synchronizing science and economics, the economics of science, the science of economics, right? I'm seeing this in America, I'm seeing this in the Scandinavian areas, and it's exciting to see that these things are being done. So don't be left behind as a nation. Don't wait till other nations pass you by. The synchronization of innovation and economic activities could begin as early as education or high school education, but definitely it shouldn't be going later than the bachelor's level education. And these things must be intentional, very, very, very important, right? They must be done strategically, they must be done with a lot of planning. And that's why I said it begins with the targeting, right? This week's episode is focusing on doing the targeting. Very important. It is a role of visionary leadership to do the targeting. What are we targeting it at? And then, of course, the second question is, what are we targeting at it? What are we targeting it at? We're targeting it at a synchronization, right? We're targeting the synchronization at increased economic growth, competitiveness, leverage, and so many possibilities. But what are we targeting at it is a question to also answer, right? Yes, we know we are targeting increased synchronization between innovation and economic activities, and part of what we should be targeting at it is that, for instance, greater curriculum relevance. Very, very, very important, right? We have to ensure that we have responsive curricula. Very, very important, right? I was in a webinar on I think on Saturday, and the host was talking about the need for increased competence. And I remember saying, this issue, when I was asked to comment, I said, look, this issue of increased competence in the marketplace is something that we have to get more intentional with at the policy level. I've given that example on this program before, right? Or either this or the previous program, but I think it was on this quarter's program. I gave the example of Jamie Dimon, who is the most influential banker in the United States today. He's the CEO of Chase Bank, right? When Jamie Dimon sneezes today, some people catch cold. Jamie Dimon was saying recently that they shouldn't have private equity firms that are already signing young bankers even before they begin their job. So in other words, the private equity firms were basically waiting for the banks to train them, then they will coach them. And before long, some private equity firms began to publicly renounce that practice. That's how much of influence he had. He said because it was distracting the young bankers, and if they were not careful, it was going to cause them to be disadvantaged because less of them would be hired, especially these days when a number of their jobs can be easily taken over by ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence tools. And it was, people were watching to see what will happen. And before long, private equity firms and top recruitment firms, at least two, publicly renounced that practice. That's how much of influence Jamie Dimon has, right? I'm saying that to say when someone of that level is speaking based on data, he's speaking based on analysis, he's speaking based on studies. And what was he saying? One of the things he said is that many times when they release young graduates from universities, even after 4 years, they are often incapable of stepping into market roles, right? The marketplace roles. And even in the United States, Jamie Dimon was leading advocacy for a greater synchronization between the town and gown, between the marketplace competence needs and the curriculum. Of course, you know that in other nations, the gap may even be wider than what you have in the US, but I'm just saying, if the United States has that challenge, if the Chase Bank has that challenge, what more do you think is happening in other places? However, the conversation has started, and that's what we are advocating for at Amogate, right? That's on Amogate Radio Communications and at Amogate Consult. We keep saying, look, there needs to be a greater synchronization between not just the town and the gown, but honestly, the industry and the labs, between the policymakers. But today's conversation is taking it to an even higher level. This is a level we've never spoken to this directly before. That synchronization must happen at the highest level of policy. The secretaries, as they are called in some countries like the United States, or the ministers, as they are called in other nations, must be made to have synchronization as one of their key performance indicators. I repeat. The secretaries of, for instance, science and technology, or secretaries of innovation, or the ministers, as they are called in that nation, in some other nations, of science and technology, and the minister of innovation, and the minister of education, and as well as the ministers or those in charge of economic growth, those that lead the feds, the treasury secretaries, the minister of economic development, and whatever you call them in your nation. Part of their key performance indicators going forward must be the level of synchronization. The level of synchronization between their activities in education and innovation, as well as that of economic growth. They also must understand that they are not educating for the sake of educating. They are educating to position the nation for greater economic relevance, for greater economic competitiveness, for greater economic responsiveness. So by the time they know that one of their key performance indicators is the connectedness, the connectability, let me use that word, the connectability of their outputs, right, with that of other ministries or other departments, then it becomes an area of strategic connection. It becomes an area of strategic focus. Right, I think that's what I want to say more. It becomes an area of strategic focus when they know that the connectability of their output as the Ministry of Education, as Ministry of Science and Technology, the connectability of their output with that of the Ministry of Economic Growth and Development is going to be what they are evaluated by. Then it becomes an area of strategic focus. And this is the responsibility of none other than that of the president, or the prime minister, or the premier, or whatever the role may be, or the king. Some would even say king. I think in Lesotho, for instance, they would say the king of Lesotho. So by whatever the nomenclature of the overall leadership goes by, the role of synchronizing or facilitating this synchronization between the town and gown, like the likes of Jamie Dimon are complaining about, must rest with the overall leaders of nations. Very, very critical. Well, this is still Tolu Omodari on Amogate Radio Communications. The theme of this quarter's program has been driving economic growth with innovation. We are gradually coming to the end of quarter 2, 2025. And this is the second to the last I believe this is the second to the last Tuesday in the month of June. The next Tuesday will be June 24, and that will be the last Tuesday for the month of June. So we might safely say this is the second to the last episode of this program by the grace of God. So we need to start driving home some points, right? Everything we have been saying from the beginning of this quarter will not be achievable and will not be achieved if the overall leadership of the nation does not take full accountability for ensuring a synchronization between innovative activities and economic growth, right? And part of how they should facilitate it, like, is doing the targeting. Like we have said, there must be a clear sense of direction, a clear sense of strategic focus. What exactly are we trying to achieve? What are we targeting? And of course, there's also the question of how are we targeting? We've spoken a little bit of how are we targeting. Education is one, performance evaluation is another that we just spoke about, right? As a CEO of an organization, I would meet with different heads of the organization. As the head of a department, I will meet with different heads of the different units. And so as a president, I'm also in the know that there are several meetings that are held. They call it cabinet meetings in some nations. At those cabinet meetings, right, there must be clear performance expectation at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of the quarter. June 30 will be half year. When the evaluation is being done, even the department heads, the ministry heads should be evaluated based on the level of synchronization they are attaining across the departments, ministries, and agencies. Very, very important. I think I'm going to drop one or two more points and then we call it a day for today's episode by God's grace, right? How do we do the targeting, right? The overall leadership has a responsibility for doing the targeting, but how exactly do we do the targeting? Yes, we've talked about synchronizing, we've talked about education, we've talked about performance evaluation. I believe another thing to also recognize is that even the innovative activities themselves also need to gain greater efficiency. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Sometimes when government invests in different innovation centers, if they're not careful, they tend to also do some things repetitively, right? So one innovation center may be doing the same thing that another innovation center is doing in the same nation, right? Sometimes even in the same state within the same nation. So there needs to be greater and that is in itself a waste. I'm not talking about the deliberate repetitiveness. Sometimes we deliberately want to replicate. That's different. Sometimes we want to have different organizations or different institutions attempt to attain the same goal or the same outcome, the same result in different ways. That could be very intentional. That's different. But if it is an uncoordinated repetition, right, and you have different innovation centers doing the same thing, then it's a waste of sometimes inadequate innovation resources, right? And that way, by the time the innovation or the invention gets to market, is already overpriced. I remember working in an organization many years ago, and the organization had a strategy called loss leadership. They would deliberately go into a market in another nation and crash the price. And once they crash the price and they gain monopoly of the market, they then control the price, and the strategy was called loss leadership. So sometimes as nations, if you're not careful, you are not going to be in a position to compete well with nations that have economic wherewithal to practice this loss leadership strategy, because already, if you're not careful, you're already coming in with an inefficiently produced creative output. Very, very important. So another way to compete economically, remember, you're supposed to be targeting your innovation at economic competitiveness. So another way to gain economic competitiveness is to try to make sure that your innovation is as efficiently priced as possible. Very, very important. And that begins with ensuring a greater synchronization between your different innovation units. I strongly believe that those in charge of national innovation systems should be coordinating the different institutions responsible for different aspects of innovation. Sometimes you're looking at medical innovation, sometimes you're looking at military innovation, sometimes you're looking at agricultural technologies. We spoke about that last quarter. There are different things as a nation that you can be deliberately targeting. Remember, the question of what are you targeting is very important. Some nations need to target food self-reliance. Some nations have all the money in the world, but if a nation sneezes, they will catch cold because almost all their processed food is coming from that nation. That's not very strategic. Some nations will say, you know what we want to target is sufficiency, self-sufficiency, food self-sufficiency, agricultural self-sufficiency, whatever you're targeting. Now, when you have overall goal, remember that's the role of overall leadership, to define the overall goal of what you are targeting your innovative activities at and how you want to use it to attain economic competitiveness, especially in a given period. There is the strong need to then coordinate the different innovation centers so that different innovation centers in the nation are looking at different aspects of it. And if there must be repetition or deliberate replication, let it at least be also coordinated, because once there is an inefficient coordination of innovative activities, of creative activities, then by the time you are producing the output, the invented output, if you are not careful, it competes optimally. You can operate at the competitive end of the global value chain if you're not careful, because you're coming with an overpriced or an inefficiently priced creative output. So that's another way to do the targeting, right? There must be greater coordination. The heads of nations, the presidents of nations must charge the ministers of innovation with ensuring a greater synchronization amongst the innovation centers, innovation institutions, so that they are not suboptimally utilizing innovation resources. By the time they do that, like I said, if they're not careful, whatever it is they're producing is already overpriced and cannot compete economically. And once that happens, of course, the end users will go for the more efficiently priced innovative output. Very, very important, right? Of course, we've spoken about DeepSeek, the competition between DeepSeek and NVIDIA. I think that was in last quarter's episode, and how DeepSeek is a Chinese organization, or a Chinese artificial intelligence output that practically crashed the price, and NVIDIA had to find a way to respond, because in fact it was like almost like a dream for NVIDIA initially when they came out with their products, and NVIDIA's price share price crashed significantly. But thankfully they've also been able to sort of catch up. They've been able to respond, right? But the main point here, what I want you to walk away with, is that price is a key competition factor, right? It's not enough to create something innovative. Once you are thinking about innovation for economic growth, you must also be able to ensure that a creative output can compete price-wise on the global market, because inventors in other nations are also creating, and they have sometimes the capacity to underprice, sometimes deliberately, to gain market leverage or to gain market share, and so on and so forth. So to start with, from the beginning of that chain, of that production chain, you must control cost as a nation. And that's why you must synchronize your innovation efforts as a nation to make sure there's no unnecessary duplication, no unnecessary replication that would not enable you compete price-wise on the global scale. My name is Silto Lomodara, and I'm with Ready Communications. We are looking at the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic activity, and we are looking at the second part, which is doing the targeting. It's the role of leaders to target innovative activities at economic growth, and they have to define how they want to target it, what aspect they want to target, and what strategy they also want to use to attain this. Very, very important. Well, we'll make just one more point, last but definitely not least. It's also important to recognize that when you talk about technology developers and involvement of technology users in any innovation is something to be very conscious of, right? The users play a critical role in the acceptability of creative output. I repeat, the users, in other words, the market, they play a very crucial role in the acceptability of creative output. Remember, again, we are now talking innovation for the sake of economic growth, not for the sake of having some scientific fun, right? So when technology developers are creating, it's also important that, national innovation systems are supported to ensure that there is sufficient human resources, policy and regulations, as well as comprehensive knowledge on, on how to monitor, assess, interpret market demand. I need to say that again. Because technology is not just for the sake of technology, like I've been saying for almost an entire quarter. We are coming to the end of the quarter two. We've been saying this for almost an entire quarter, that technology is not just for the sake of technology development, but for the sake of market penetration and economic competitiveness, right? Then technology developers must understand, they may know it in passing, but they must, understand much more deeply that the role of the users, the technology users, is very, very critical, and that whether or not there is high-level user adoption is influenced by many factors. Sometimes these things need to be studied, and this we have alluded to it already, to ensure a greater synchronization between scientific thinking and economic capabilities. But for now, let's just say that nations, right, may need to have those who are understudying, the what influences user demand, user adoption, market penetration, market demand. So at the national level, right, especially when it comes to synchronizing innovative activities and economic development, the nations, the policymakers also need to ensure that there are quality human resources to support the study of user adoption factors, and there are also related policies and regulations to enable comprehensive knowledge on market demand factors and influencers. Very, very, very important. And again, this is not something that the Ministry of Labour would likely do on his or her own, on its own, or the Minister of Labour would likely do on his or her own, or the Ministry of Economic Development would likely do on his or her own, or the Ministry of Innovation would likely do. But this is something that the overall leadership of the nation has to facilitate. This synchronization is something that the overall leadership has to facilitate across all those ministries, departments, and agencies. That synchronization will lead to that study, because yes, the technology users will not necessarily be the technology developers, right? Those who are responsible for managing the technology developers would likely be in the Ministry of Innovation, right? Ministry of Science and Technology, or Ministry of Innovation, or Department of Innovation, or however they are called in different nations. But those who are responsible for understuding the market will likely be inclined more towards the departments responsible for economic, for consumer protection, for consumer, monitoring. So there now needs to be the oversight function, right? The role responsible for overseeing both the Ministry of Technology, Science and Technology, the Ministry of Innovation, as well as the departments responsible for understanding the market, consumer behavior. It is the role that oversees both that should then be synchronizing deliberately, intentionally, strategically from a point of policy, facilitating the synchronization and a synergy between these two departments to ensure a more accurate and effective study of factors influencing user adoption, technology adoption, and market penetration. If that does not happen, believe me, it will still be technology development for the sake of fun, scientific fun. In other words, innovation for the sake of innovation, rather than innovation for the sake of optimal economic growth and development. Wow. It's on this note that I'm going to call it a day on today's edition of Driving Economic Growth with Innovation. I hope you have understood what we have said. Please and please and please don't just stop there like we started with at the beginning of this edition of the program. Life is a gift. The opportunity you have to influence policy is a gift, to take decisions that benefit millions and hundreds of millions of people in your nation. Some nations have, I think 1 billion. It's a gift, it's a privilege. Use that gift and use that privilege well. Let's change nations. Let's inform, change, effective, positive changes in institutions. Let's make our society significantly better because of the things we're sharing. We are passionate about these things because we believe that these things can transform nations, institutions, and organizations, and of course ultimately touch families and individuals as well. So please let us use these things we've heard. We are always ready to work with you in Amalgate. Call us. We can support you as nations. We can support you at the level of supranational entities. If it's EU, if it's DFID, if it's World Bank, this is what we do. We've worked with GIZ. We've worked with ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African states. We've worked with private sector organizations. We've worked with public sector institutions, like the entire state judiciary. This is what we do. This is what we've done for about 17 years. We love what we do and we do what we love. Let's work with you to build nations and institutions and organizations that would ensure optimal utilization of innovative investment activities and pursuits. Thank you so much. This has been very, very fulfilling for us, and I'll be back same time, same station next week for the final edition of the quarter. Until then, please join my colleagues. They will continue to be here Wednesday. We're always here Monday through Friday, bringing this thoughtful, inspiring, and instructive programs. And of course, you can check us out on www.theamoge.org. You can send us an email on contact@theamoge.org. You can follow us on all our LinkedIn, Facebook, and other social media pages, Instagram, and of course you can also subscribe to Amoge Radio Communications on YouTube, where you will get automatically notified of these programs, and you can also access over 250 of such programs on different issues, ranging from policy to geopolitical issues, to strategy, to public health, and so on and so forth. Thank you so much again for doing this with me. I'm very grateful again for the privilege of sharing, of being your host. I remain Tola Mother, and I'll be back same time, same station next week by the grace of God. Until then, remember, life is a gift, and make the best use of it. Thank you.